Welcome everyone to J School. We're just going to give everyone a minute to come into the classroom before we begin.
We'll keep appropriately socially distanced.
Yes. Leave a chair between each of you.
Some of us are very distant socially or otherwise.
Indeed. All right, I continue to see the numbers tick up for participants. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I would like to welcome everyone to the first ever session of J School. J School is a free virtual learning series that examines many of the key issues that drive the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the design was done to examine these issues with a holistic look at political, historical, and personal elements that influence the development of the conflict. All, of course, with an eye toward how we can work as pro-Israel, pro-peace advocates to achieve a lasting peace. So I am Dr. Christine Beresniova, the Director of Education and Public Engagement at J Street. And today we are very pleased to kick off our J School series with a timely and important look at the history of Zionism. And I am joined today by Jeremy Ben-Ami, the President and Founder of J Street, and Dr. Fania Oz-Salzberger, Professor of Law and Faculty of Humanities at the University of Haifa, and both are also children of well-known parents and families. So this is no ordinary chronological listing of Zionist schools of thought. There's not going to be a quiz at the end. Rather, Jeremy and Fania today will walk us through key moments in history through the narratives of their own family experiences. And so for the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to look at the history of Zionism writ large through the details of family experiences on a very personal level. And we're going to do that in 4 chapters. So the first chapter is going to be the 18th through the 19th century. Our second chapter will be the turn of the 20th century up to the founding of Israel. The third chapter will be 1948 and the socialist revisionist movements. And 4, we will conclude with the challenges we are facing today. We will take questions throughout the talk, so feel free to put them in the Q&A. You can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, right next to the participants button. I will be keeping time. As the participants already know, I'm the mean one for today, so I will be keeping us on task. So that means about 10 to 12 minutes per chapter. So this is definitely not a comprehensive analysis, but a narrative story of Zionism. And therefore, I just want to draw your attention as well. There is a link on the J School webpage that has additional recommended readings if you wish to read more on this subject. And I will share that link in the chat. I also want to call out 3 very special recommendations. Of course, texts by our authors today. Jews and Words by Amos Oz and Fania. A Tale of Love and Darkness by Amos Oz, and then A New Voice for Israel by Jeremy Ben-Ami. And so we will also put the links to those 3 works in the chat as well. You will also find questions in the link to our recommended readings that challenge us to think about the following things as we listen and engage with the talk today. And these 3 questions that we would pose to you to think about are, what is your relationship to Zionism? How is the history of Zionism part of the conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And finally, how does what we learn today inform our work as pro-peace advocates? So it is without further ado, please sharpen your pencils and help me welcome Jeremy Ben-Ami and Dr. Fania Oz-Salzberger. Jeremy.
Thanks so much, Christine, and welcome everybody. This is very exciting for us, both the concept of J School and beginning this process, but also the opportunity to have an in-depth conversation about Zionism. And I'm so excited, couldn't be more excited to be doing this with Fania. And my personal connection to her and to her family is deep, a loving relationship and a shared set of experiences and thoughts and hopes. And I hope that will all come through today in our conversation, Fania. To discuss Zionism in 21st century Jewish life, in the United States in particular, I can't speak for in Israel, but it is a often very political conversation that comes with a lot of freight, a lot of baggage, a lot of assumptions, a lot of misunderstandings, and the very word Zionism has become itself a flashpoint, and people find it hard to identify as a Zionist in some circles today, even if they share the roots of the idea of having a national home for the Jewish people in the state of Israel. And so today, what I really hope we can do is dig a little bit into the history, dig into the roots and the meaning of the word, so that people can have a little bit of a greater perspective as they hear, for instance, Peter Beinart come out with a new article last week that essentially, in a way renounces his vision of Zionism that he has always held for his life and moves in a different direction. To even have the conversation about what that article means, one has to go back a couple hundred years to really begin to understand why did a movement begin among a part of the world's Jews in Europe and in Eastern and Western Europe, Russia, central empires of the era. Why did the Jewish people begin to think about a different manifestation of their identity, trying to find a way to get to freedom, to a better life? And I think it requires, Fania, beginning with an understanding of what life was like for Jews in Europe. And again, I want to say at the outset, we're only talking from your and my perspective of the European experience. There's a whole other experience in Jewish life that was happening in Arab world, the Mizrahi Jewish experience that is not the family experience that you and I had. But the roots of this movement start in Europe in the 18th, 17th, maybe 18th, 19th centuries. And so finally, I want to kick it over to you and ask you to expand a little bit about your family and where they were in those centuries and what was going on around them.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. I'm grateful to you, Jeremy, and to the whole wonderful J Street team, and congratulate you on the festive opening today of J School. Oh boy, we need schools, we need education, we need talking, we need mutual respect and plenty of debate. So this is the most Jewish thing one can do, and I'm happy to be part of the school. Before I take you all the way back to a couple of small, even tiny villages in 18th and 19th century Lithuania and Bessarabia, what is today part of South Ukraine, I want to say a word about Peter Beinart's article mentioned here by Jeremy. When Peter Beinart despairs of the chance for the future for a Jewish state, he is speaking his mind, and that is perfectly legitimate. But to me, the existence of a sovereign state for the Jews is not a political question. Indeed, it's not a question at all. No other country in the world, including North Korea, is being questioned on the basis of its very existence. Neither are we. I respect Peter's feelings. I am sorry about his despair, but anyone who decides that a Jewish state is no longer viable is either very hostile or very desperate. I'm afraid Peter is very desperate these days. I am not. So having said that, and maybe getting back to my absence of desperation towards the end of the webinar, let me take you to the tiny village of Olkeniki in Lithuania, what was part of the Russian Tsarist Empire in the 18th century, where one part of my family hails from, and to a tiny village and a tiny town in what used to be Bessarabia, today South Ukraine, on the Black Sea, where another part of my family came from. And in between, throughout the spectrum of Eastern Europe, mostly under the Tsar, partly under the Austrian Empire, partly under the German Empire, Jews have been living since the late Middle Ages in declining conditions, mostly of poverty and of facing active, hostile, violent, murderous anti-Semitism in waves. In between, they eked out a living. In between, they wrote books and read books, and mostly they were very orthodox and contained within their small sphere in a hostile world until the 19th century. So when we go back along my father's line, we can go all the way back to the 14th century. We're quite fortunate in that. The Klausner family goes back to Vienna of the 14th century. But here I'm talking about the late 18th century, when the great-great-grandparents of my father met and married in Lithuania, still very orthodox, very unworldly, turning their back on both history and time, certainly on modernity. They begin to change. And in the family annals, we can see this change. I'm sure that also in yours, Jeremy, by the mid-19th century, the family in Lithuania and the family in Bessarabia are or can be defined as middle class, beginning to open up to the world, to continue their Jewish orthodoxy alongside rumors of the great modernization of the Enlightenment, of new ideas, technology, and science. Zionism is born exactly when the branches of my family, and I suppose also of yours, begin to meet modernity head on. It is preceded, Zionism is preceded by a wonderful cultural, intellectual movement called the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, recreated by the Jews, based not just directly on Enlightenment ideas from the West, like the American founding fathers, John Locke, Rousseau, Kant. They knew something about them, but mostly they had the blessing of Jewish mediators like Moses Mendelssohn and others. By the late 19th century, they are creating their own national culture. In Hebrew, which they are modernizing as they go along, in Yiddish, which they are beginning to cherish as a mamelotion, but also as a cultural language. And they begin to realize that the gap between the promises of modernity and what they see around them in the villages and towns, and even in the cities of Vilnius or Odessa, it is a huge gap. The everyday anti-Semitism, the government hostility, the impoverished lifestyle of most Jews, the angst, the fear, the bouts of pogroms and murder, vis-a-vis the great promise of the Enlightenment, which has reached them both directly and via the Jewish Haskalah. And they begin to ask themselves, where are we going from here? Geographically from Eastern Europe, which was the worst area, and of course most Jews were concentrated there. And spiritually and intellectually, are we joining modernity or staying out? And if we join modernity, how do we do it? Just one word before I pass the microphone, the virtual microphone, back to you, Jeremy. We are talking here of Ashkenazi Jewry. One has to remember that Ashkenazi Jewry, until the Nazi genocide of the Jews, Ashkenazis were about 90% of the Jewish people in all its diasporas. The fact that the Jews of the East, from Iran and Iraq of today, via Yemen and Ethiopia to North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, were only 10% until the Nazis, does not justify the fact that we shall not be able to discuss them in detail tonight. It's night in Israel, this morning, in this webinar, because we are not their descendants, except for one branch of my family, which I shall mention later. So we are telling part of the story, we are telling it with love, and we are very open to listen to stories from other parts of the Jewish diaspora of the pre-Zionist era. Let me stop here with my ancestors surrounded by hostility and anti-Semitism, but already aware of modernity and the option of intellectual renewal, and move to you, Jeremy. How did your family do back in the 19th century?
So I have two branches, my mother and my father. My mother was in Central Europe and was very much part of the integration of the Jewish people of Vienna and the surrounding areas into the cultural and economic and business life of that city, and becoming extremely assimilated and very engaged. And I think it is a, it's very much the life that Theodor Herzl was born into, interestingly enough, and we'll be transitioning to him in that era in a second. But that part of my family had no interest in Zionism. You know, this was not the part of my family that was engaged in the founding of the state. But it is the part of the family that then suffered from the Holocaust. And their disengagement from these ideas and this thinking and from the reality of what was around them, I think, helped to set the stage for what would become a tragedy later. My father's side, however, was in the same, the Pale of Settlement. Both of the villages that my grandmother and grandfather came from were in modern-day Belarus. And both of their families made the decision in the late 19th century, part of whether it was Hoveve Zion or it was part of Hibat Zion, or I don't know exactly which movement particularly, but there was a movement pre-Herzl of initial pioneers who decided to break from their rabbi's judgment that they should wait for the Messiah and to take the desire to build their future into their own hands. And it was very much a movement of self-empowerment. The term that Pinsker used was auto-emancipation, taking it upon oneself to find one's own freedom. And so both of my great-grandparents from those villages made their way to Palestine in the 1880s. And they were part of this very first wave of Aliyah, again, related directly to a set of pogroms that came in 1882 following the assassination of the Tsar. But that's the roots of the Zionist work before there was even a term Zionism. That was my family story for coming to the land of Israel in the 1880s.
This is wonderful because your chapter can now take us forward to our next chapter. I can see that Christine is nodding. We need to get to the creation of Zionism. We need to get to the First Zionist Congress, to Herzl, the great Herzl, and then to rush through, I'm afraid, but we will have to do that, all the way to the buildup of the Yishuv in Eretz Israel, or the Jewish settlements in the land of Israel, Palestine, under the Ottoman Empire, the 2 world wars, British mandate in Palestine, and finally, for this chapter, the Holocaust, immediately after which Zionism emerged victorious upon the most tragic moment in Jewish history. And let me suggest that we do it in the following way. I will remain in East Europe with a spotlight on Hibat Zion, on the pre-Zionism that gave Herzl the push. Then we will see what made Herzl tick, what happened to the East European Jews, not only the Zionists, but also the others. And then I will get back to those Central European Jews who felt comfortable and did not mostly associate with Zionism. Part of my husband's family belonged to that Yeke clan, we call them Yekes, Central European Jews with a heavy German accent. And say something about the unique tragedy of that part of the Jewish world, also about its Zionism, because they did have a profound Zionist impact as well.
Fania, we do have one question about Zionism as to why there was no appreciable Zionist sentiment during the long period prior to what we're talking about now. I'm not sure if you or Jeremy want to answer that.
Good question, and maybe I will say a couple of quick things about it. Thank you for the question. Jews always hoped, dreamed, prayed to get back to the land of Israel ever since we were exiled, by the way, gradually, not suddenly, not in one go, but in several waves. In the very late antiquity and early Middle Ages, Jews sometimes came to Israel, mostly to die there, to be buried there, perhaps to write a poem or two like Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, but at no point during that time did the idea of a Jewish nation state emerge until early modernity. Because during the Middle Ages, late antiquity, Middle Ages, people don't think in terms of nation states. This is not an option. Anywhere in Europe, by the way. There are empires, there are big entities like France or England, but the nation state is not an ideology. Indeed, there are no ideologies. Ideology is modern, it is born around 1900, and this is where the Jews can kick off a new idea of the nation state. One genius from the 17th century already predicted something like that, Baruch Spinoza, who in a footnote, a tiny little phrase, as geniuses go, you know, he predicts that one day Jews may reenact their sovereign state in the land of Israel, no less. But we needed, excuse me, we needed the rise of nationalism or nationhood, the idea, the ideology of nations and states coming together, each nation deserving in principle, of course, its own territory, its own piece of land and free air to breathe. It was not heavy nationalism that inspired the Zionists. It was a more level-handed sense of national identity and feeling, combined, may I say, and this is important, combined with humanism, combined with a certain political liberalism, live and let live. We do not want to be a persecuted minority, nor do we want others to be persecuted minority. And this theme of the Haskalah, combining something very ancient and Jewish, our memories of the biblical and Mishnaic land, with something very modern, national identity, the nation state, freedom as a nation and freedom as individuals. This comes together in the Haskalah and creates a particular branch of Haskalah called Zionism. Before Herzl's Zionism, we are talking about Chibat Zion. I am quite sure that our ancestors met somewhere there, Jeremy, because my family now in Odessa, the same branch from Lithuania, are now part of the Odessa circle. Chibat Zion, Bialik is there, Chernichovsky is there, Achad Ha'am, many other great people. They do literature and philosophy, and they already make plans, ideas, dreams about a new Jewish life and existence as a community, as a people, as a nation, as a culture, speaking modernized Hebrew in Israel. Herzl came from elsewhere. He came from the other side of Jeremy's genealogy, family tree, from Vienna, and before that his family came from Hungary. And he had some Orthodox bones in his body. People think that Herzl was a total Chiloni, secular. He was not. His grandpa was a rabbi. He knew where he came from. But he met the fist of anti-Semitism in Vienna and later in Paris in the Dreyfus affair. Unlike the East European Jews, of whom he doesn't know much when he starts off, he is terribly hurt and insulted because he thought anti-Semitism was over. He thought Central and West Europe were enlightened. He trusted the Enlightenment, modernism, modern economy. He was economically very fascinated with industry, with new inventions, and suddenly comes the Dreyfus affair. And before that, in Vienna as a student, he already encountered anti-Semitism. And this is not everyday reality as in Eastern Europe, but a terrible insult for West European Jews, which is why people like Herzl and the Rothschild family and Max Nordau, a German Jew, and before them Moses Hess, a great thinker preceding Herzl, this is why they came together with the East European Chibat Zion and other early Zionist groups and convened the Zionist Congress, the first congresses in Basel. So by the time they are there, they know what they're about, and Herzl is busy writing the grand scheme, which is the pilot, and he did the archetype of the whole Zionist project. You know, Zionism is very, very spectral. It goes in many directions, but Herzl is a kind of a linchpin. The future state of the Jews, mind you, not a Jewish state, but the state of the Jews, Judenstaat, will be a liberal democracy. It will have a non-Jewish citizenry, which will be treated equally and respectfully. It will have voting rights for everybody, by the way, including women, men and women, Jews and Arabs. The gender issue was totally pioneering, but so was the other issue of everyone in the country being eligible to vote. This was Herzl. And an economy, a third way economy of some social justice alongside with a free market, but humanism. That was the underlying theme. Nobody will go hungry, nobody will starve, Nobody will have no insurance, no medical insurance. Everyone would be part of a society of solidarity. This is Herzl, and this is wonderful. By the time, yes.
One thing I was going to dig into a little bit here, though, is the way in which Herzl and the, let's say, the Western European Zionists envisioned they would go about getting their state. That this was a very, very diplomacy-oriented, very sort of work within the proper channels approach. And there was even consideration at a certain point that perhaps it didn't even need to be in the land of Israel, that this was a request that would be made to the powers that be, that there might be a place that you could find. And it was always from that part of the Zionist movement done within the proper channels, let's say. It wasn't going to be a fight and it wasn't going to take something. It was going to be done within the context of international diplomacy. Is that something that you think is important as well to the Herzl view, and that ultimately became more, let's say the Chaim Weizmann view? And
totally, both Herzl and Chaim Weizmann, who joined in, and other diplomats carried what we call today a very soft diplomacy, trying usually behind the curtains to talk to every possible emperor, minister, ambassador, you name it. They had a few successes and a lot of failures, but the idea was that one of the superpowers, one of the empires, hopefully the Ottoman, maybe the German, maybe the British, would somehow allow the Jews their place under the sun. And speaking about alternatives to the land of Israel, this was very seriously considered. Herzl himself was part of a big debate about the Uganda option. We know today that there were at least 6 different locations on 5 different continents where dreamers of the 20th century were hoping to create a Jewish autonomy or even a small state. But eventually it turned out, quite quickly when it came to the Ugandan option, that in order to put together the energy, the spirit, the dream, the power, the raw power of the multitudes of Jews, mainly in East Europe, but also in the Middle East and elsewhere, we need the land of Israel. Nothing else could awaken the nation the way it did. Not that I would personally have rejected the Uganda option if I was part of the early Zionist Congresses. I don't think I would. I would have considered it very carefully. But it turned out that the land of Israel remained the sole option, especially during the First World War, when the greatest early diplomatic achievement of Zionism was accomplished in the form of the Balfour Declaration. Lord Balfour, British minister, friend of Weizmann, putting out a declaration about a national home for the Jews in Palestine when the British occupied, as they hope to be doing quite soon, and they do, and they set up a mandate, and they begin to create, both the British regime begins to create the scaffolding of a national home, not just for the Jews, but eventually also for the Palestinians. This turned out to be the famous plan of dividing the country between the 2 nations that the United Nations accepted in 1947, but that tragically the Palestinians and some of the Jews rejected. So Herzl's—
If I could.
Yes.
Fania, just to interrupt, we have some great questions about Herzl here, asking for a little bit more context about who is he, why the great Herzl, and didn't Herzl in his final days become aware, as you were just alluding to, that there was a significant presence of non-Jews in Palestine? And I remember also from reading Jeremy's book, this is the period, I think, Jeremy, where your family travels to Israel, both sides. Maybe you could also speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Well, I mean, I would say that it's important for my family history to recognize that we were there well before Herzl, that it was 20 years before. But what I think is important at this point is that the families and the people that lived in Palestine were beginning to take more of an active role in the development of Zionism, what had been debated in Basel and in European and in Russian, whether it was meeting houses or coffee houses or universities or wherever the debates were taking place in the 19th century, leading into the early part of the 20th, much of that was done very intellectually and without a grounding on the ground in the land of Israel. But as you get into the 20th century, and my father's born in 1913, he goes to the Herzliya Gymnasia, he studies with Ben Yehuda, who is turning Hebrew into an actual language of day-to-day use on the ground in Palestine for Palestinian-born Jews, who for the first time in the history of the Jewish people for, centuries and centuries are now learning secular learning in the language of 2,000 years ago. They began to take more ownership over the discussion of what the effort would be to try to achieve the goal of Zionism. And at the same time, they were also confronting the reality that there was another people there, and that other people had similarly a nationalism and a desire to have their freedom and their independence from the colonial powers that had been ruling them. And so a lot of those developments began to be more significant in the conversation in the land of Israel itself. And the revisionist movement, which I think is the important split in Zionism that gives us an understanding of where we are today, begins in this era, in the late 1920s, early 1930s, as the impatience of a group of people from within Palestine, born there, many of them from more Eastern European backgrounds, who began to despair of the chance that diplomacy and soft diplomacy was actually going to get anywhere. And they said, if you want something, this is the Jabotinsky school of Zionism, if you want something, you have to take it, that the world understands power. And if you're going to achieve independence, it's not going to be through nice meetings in London and Paris and wherever else you're going to try to build diplomatic support. It's going to be because you have actually shown the power and the force to take it. And that fight, the split within Zionism between the more socialist, humanist Zionism that leads to Ben Gurion and that is today the center left in Israel, and the revisionist Zionism of Jabotinsky and ultimately Begin, begins to come out in the 1930s in a real split in the land of Israel. And Fania, I know your dad was in one side of this as well. My family was squarely on the revisionist side. That's our roots.
Yeah, I think we are related in quite a few ways, Jeremy. I don't know whether you've had your genes checked yet, but we should look it up. But here we're talking about intellectual genetics, which is much more interesting. Let me say something about Herzl. And I think we need a special J-School webinar dedicated to Herzl alone. Be quiet. We have a Jewish dog here, I'm sorry. Yeah. Herzl was a liberal humanist Zionist. And Herzl is the one person, the one founding father that we desperately need today if we want to save Zionism. It's that simple, and I'm fast forwarding to the end of our discussion. Herzl expressed an ideology that I, as a liberal, can live with, that I, as a Democrat, applaud, that I, as a Jew and a Zionist, can only hope that would win the day again. It won the day back in 1900. And this ideology was very well aware of the presence of Arabs in the land of Israel. They were not yet called Palestinians. It doesn't matter. Palestinians in the land of Israel, most of them very poor farmer living under Ottoman feudalism with absentee landlords. And the Jews were already coming in. Of course, there was an old community, the old Yishuv of very Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem, in Tzfat, already there before Zionism. Some of them begin to cross over the young people into the early Zionist groups. And the early Zionist groups begin to create their settlements or moshavot. Right now, I'm sitting in one of them, Zichron Yaakov, as the sun is setting over the Mediterranean Sea. Some of the founders of this moshava were distant relatives of my mother's, including a great-great-great-grandfather buried here. This is meaningful. They bought the land, of course. There was no conquest, there were no weapons. They bought the land, then they needed weapons to defend it sometimes, from the absentee Ottoman lords. And this is part of the very early stratum of the tragedy. They tried to get on with the local Arab workers, they employed them, it was not an equal relationship at all, which makes it all the more impressive that Herzl, in his wonderfully utopic novel, Alt Neuland, Old New Land, when he envisages the land of Israel, the Jewish homeland, in 1920, that was 20 years ahead when he wrote it, and it was exactly 100 years ago now. He already envisaged an Arab bourgeoisie living in Haifa and elsewhere in very good relations with the Jewish bourgeoisie, but also workers of the land. Things are solidary, things are fairly harmonious. There is one extreme Jewish nationalist, a rabbi whose name I keep forgetting for a good reason, I suppose, who wants all the Arabs out of the land of Israel, a Jewish-only nation state, and the guy is humiliatingly defeated in the first free elections of the state of the Jews. The liberals win the day, the Democrats win the day. This is Herzl. We need him today. We need his vision, we need his Jerusalem, we need his Haifa, his Jewish-Arab relationship. He didn't know much, by the way, but he knew enough, and he was a liberal. By the time Herzl is gone, and we have the First World War upturning everything and a new conquering power, a new empire, the British in the land of Israel, things are running parallel, as you said, Jeremy, in Europe and now also in America. Zionist leaders are doing their diplomacy and fundraising. On the land, a growing community of mainly agricultural settlements, either a moshava like Zichron, where I live today, or a kibbutz like Hulda, in which I was born. Some of them were very socialists. It was a mainstream, but the socialism was always a democratic socialism, not a totalitarian socialism. I think this is important, especially to an American audience who is unacquainted with Zionist socialism. I grew up educated in this spirit. It was deeply humanist. On the other side, we have the beginning of new Jewish urban life in Israel, Tel Aviv, the great creation of the early 20th century, free, liberal already then, sexy already there, all the more so now. And then we have Jerusalem, official, academic, and today increasingly nationalist. So the map was beginning to be formed, and the Jews are already having to take weapons in hand in order to defend themselves from Arab neighbors. Some of it is robbery, some of it is murder. I don't know whether I should call it a nationalist opposition or a pre-nationalist opposition on the Palestinian side, but certainly we have human beings who see a tribe of strangers come into their land and begin to live and work on it, either by purchase or by tilling desolate land or drying the swamps and creating agriculture their own. Palestinians do not like it, and they are right. Unfortunately, under the British mandate, the eruptions of Palestinian antagonism to the Zionist settlements, to the new Yishuv, do not take the form of counter-diplomacy, hardly take the form of political engagement and battle. They take the form of pure and very physical violence. The Jews share, obviously, some of the responsibility for the growth of this violence, but the high point was the Great Arab Rebellion of 36 to 39. And this is where the British, already on the verge of Second World War, decide enough is enough. We have to create a program for both Jews and Palestinians to have their own homelands in this tiny country, to share it between them. And they start working on it. And then comes the Second World War. No one expected the decimation of the Jewish people that happened during those 6 cursed years. Nobody expected it, and nobody calculated upon it, neither the Jews, nor the Zionists, nor the Arabs, nor the British, no one at all. It was a calamity of vast proportions that to some extent changed the diplomatic scale in the immediate aftermath of the war. I want to say something, Jeremy, about your relatives from Vienna, my husband's relatives, ancestors from Vienna and Frankfurt. Some of them were Zionists and came to Israel, to the land of Israel during the British mandates. Many were not, but they were beginning in the 1930s to understand that they will have to leave Germany, in some cases also to leave Austria, because danger is very near. Many East European Jews came under the same impression. When they tried to go, when they tried to migrate, many of these people, especially from East Europe, including my own grandfather, Yehuda Aryeh Klausner, and also from Central Europe, found out they have nowhere to go. The migration quotas were full. America didn't want them. Latin America was full. The Australian quota was full. There was nowhere to go. And a famous statesman from South Africa said, we South Africans are very proud of having no anti-Semitism. We want it to continue this way, and therefore we shall allow no Jews. And they go to Israel, to the land of Israel, those who can, not all, because the British mandate government is also controlling the gates. And so by the time, and I need to put it quite bluntly, by the time my husband's grandmother and her 2 daughters, his mother and aunt, find themselves in the concentration camp of Ravensbrück, they are aching for the land of Israel. They are pining for the land of Israel. They know that if they ever survive the Nazis, this is where they will go. And the grandmother is murdered, but the 2 sisters survive. And one of them, my late mother-in-law, lived to become the deputy mayor of Jerusalem under Teddy Kollek. Now, we cannot know what every Holocaust victim had in mind during those last terrible days and months and years. We do know that a great number of those murdered in the Holocaust were Zionists.
Jeremy, I think this is
I am speaking also for them.
To talk about your family as well. I know you intersect here as well, and it could take us up to the family.
Right, and I think that one of the questions that Fania is raising is, what is the reaction to the British and the limits that they're putting on the immigration? And so my father joins the revisionist movement and is part of the response to the fighting locally. The traditional, let's say, more socialist Zionist camp formed defense forces, and the revisionists, of course, formed more militia units to go more on offense. And similarly, so it was with immigration, that in the, let's say, pre-war era, those who were more in the establishment were trying to negotiate an increased number of visas, and my father was sent by Jabotinsky and Begin to Vienna to begin running illegal immigration boats a couple of years before the Haganah began its operation. And I think in the context of, could anyone have foreseen what was going to happen, one of the things that folks on the revisionist side and the right will say is that Jabotinsky foresaw the danger and was preaching and talking about the looming the volcano that would erupt and that would consume the Jewish people, particularly of Eastern Europe, and that people weren't listening. And I think in terms of understanding the different strands of our politics today, the right wing, and if you listen to Netanyahu's speeches today, for them, it is always 1938, it is always 1939, and there is always a volcano about to erupt. And if the Jewish people do not take a more proactive and more militant and forceful stand, then the volcano will consume them. And I think that understanding the politics of that moment in the late 30s and the split in the sort of more offensive and proactive approach of the right and a more diplomatic, softer approach on the left is very much paralleled in the politics of today. And that sense of a split again that I was referring to earlier, it's not enough to talk about right and left and revisionist and socialist. There's been a few questions in the Q&A, and I know that a lot of people who know this topic well know that it's much more than two camps. It's much more than two schools of thought. And we haven't, of course, discussed the cultural Zionist and the more non-state-oriented views about, let's say, the Bund or humanist approaches, which are also very important and happening. It's a very vibrant debate. It's the Jewish people, and I think it's really important to understand how much there were different schools of thought, all arguing and debating in a very vibrant way about what would be the best path for the Jewish people in light of the history of suffering and the impending doom that some of them saw.
So, Jeremy, you and I being two Jews, we also have a little bit of a dispute here. And I was waiting for the moment because there is no good Jewish conversation, as we wrote in Jews and Words, without a dash of dispute.
Exactly.
Let's focus on 47, 48, the 2 years in which we get the international community's acceptance and the United Nations decision of creating a homeland, a Jewish state, a state for the Jews and a state for the Palestinians, the opening of what is essentially a civil war within the land of Israel as the British soldiers are evacuating between local Arabs and the Jewish population, death and destruction, and also, unfortunately, the eviction of several Arab communities, of many Arab communities. Others fled. We don't know how many, but the weight of this tragedy is weighing on us and should weigh on us morally. Israel, the new state of Israel, did not come into existence in the moral, legitimate, internationally acknowledged way that the founders hoped. And the tragedy was enormous. 1 of every 100 Jewish people died, was killed in this 48 war, the Jewish War of Independence. In the Arab case, less fatalities, less casualties, but far more future calamity in the shape of mass eviction and migration, the Nakba. So anyway, you look at it, these 2 years, especially the full year of 1948, is a year of great pain and miracle to the Jews, a year of great pain and bitterness to the Arabs. This political spectrum, as you said, is a bit more complicated than that. I was born on the socialist side in a kibbutz. There was a kind of a small middle bourgeois, mainly German and Austrian, Central European citizens of the cities, economic liberals in the middle, but they were never the leading or the mainstream part. And then on the right, we have a nationalist Zionism led by the magnificent Ze'ev Jabotinsky, a thinker, a scholar, a wonderful Hebraist, a great poet, and even greater translator. The man was a genius, and he was in some ways, the nemesis, the opposite part to Ben-Gurion. We have these two grand weights weighing against each other, but we also have to remember that Jabotinsky was a disciple, a continuer of Herzl. Herzl is the father of Jabotinsky too, not only of Ben-Gurion and of Ade Gordon, the kibbutz socialist thinkers from which I hail. Jabotinsky was a nationalist, but he was a liberal nationalist. He believed in human rights to all. He believes in the value of the individual and not just the nation. He argued with himself in some of his writings, what came first, the nation or the individual? And he has a wonderful answer. He effectively says both came first. So yes, the Jabotinskite, he himself and some of his followers, including the two undergrounds, the Herzl and the Lehi, believed that Jews have to fight it out with the Arabs and also with the British, with very few reservations, because we are fighting for our lives. Yes, they had a hunch of the Holocaust. They were not the only ones, but they knew what was happening and they were desperate. Labor Zionism, the mainstream led by Ben-Gurion, also took to weapons, also began to militarize in the late 30s and early 40s to get ready for the big fight that they feared might happen. But they hoped that perhaps diplomacy will run its course and that there will be a United Nations decision, two countries that were willing to take the tiny, small, slim Israel alongside next door to the future Palestine, and they were fine with it. Until the aftermath of 1948, in which during the war itself, there was already a drive to conquer some of the parts that were meant for the future Palestine. But let me say something before we move on, and I know that Christine wants us to move on. In many ways, Ben-Gurion is still the granddaddy of the Israeli center-left today. We have more, I think, social sensitivity than he did. We realized that Ashkenazi hegemony was not such a great idea in the 1950s, and that the Mizrahi Olim and the Mizrahi Zionists should have been treated with much more respect and openness and listening. But along the main route of Israel being a liberal parliamentary democracy, we, the Israeli center-left, are descendants of Ben-Gurion. I cannot say, Jeremy, and this is our dispute, I cannot say that today's Likud or right of Likud is a legitimate descendant of Ze'ev Jabotinsky. They took the nationalism, enhanced it way beyond his original point. They took the militarism and the idea that the world is against us, and again, threw it wide, but they did not inherit his liberalism or his humanism.
It may disappoint you, given that we want to highlight the argument that is the Jewish debate, but I don't disagree with a word that you said. I actually agree 100% that Jabotinsky and the thoughts that are part of the core of the revisionist ideology are misrepresented so frequently today. And I do think that, for instance, Israel's president, Ruby Rivlin, to me, is one of the very few people that to this day carries forward the true ideology, the small L liberalism that I think is such a critical part of understanding Jabotinsky and his ideology, and the nationalism and the sense of militarism and ethno-nationalism that has emerged on the right bears no resemblance whatsoever to the thoughts that gave birth to the Herut party, eventually the Likud party, and it is a tragedy, really, that it's kind of like the Republican Party in the United States. In the era of Donald Trump, we've lost this sane and moderate right of center voice in the United States, and I think that there's a real loss of the Jabotinsky style voice.
Yes, I can compliment that by saying that Ruby Rivlin and my father went to school together. They sat together in class for years during the 1940s in Jerusalem. They were both from well-known revisionist Jabotinskite families. And today, both Ruby Rivlin, may he live to 120, and my late father are the bane of the extreme right wing in Israel. So this only proves the point. Christine,
all right, since we're agreeing, I'm going to wrap it up on a positive note. I don't know if it feels like it, but we have been talking for an hour. There are some wonderful and amazing questions in the chat that we simply cannot get to. But I do need to thank you both for joining us and sharing your personal stories with us today and taking us on a personal walk through the history of Zionism.
Can I just say that I'm very happy for you to share my email address with all our participants, and anyone who has questions for me is very welcome to send them in brief to me, and I would do my best to respond.
And I would also just add that one thing we've learned, I think, Christine, from this is that this is a topic that is in no way possible to tackle in a 1 hour 101. But I hope that what it does is it whets people's appetite to understand a bit more the debates and the very, very rich and vibrant history of Zionism that underlies the politics of today. And that there is no one ideology, there is no one definition. And in fact, it is a label that applies to the debate, as Fania was saying, that the argument within the Jewish people about what is the best path forward for the Jewish people in their place in this world. Some people would say we need a safe refuge. Some people would say we have to build a light unto the nations and a city on a hill. Some people might say we need to fulfill God's vision, and we're only doing this because God has commanded us to.
Or some people would say to create a commune that would make the Russian communists feel very, very pale next to it. Yes.
And all of that is within the Zionist umbrella. And all of those arguments are well over a century old, and I think are informative of the politics that J Street works in today, and helpful. It's not a word to be avoided. It's not a word that should somehow have turned into a negative description. It is, in fact, a very vibrant, lively political discourse, and I think we've kicked it off only today.
If I may end with a quote from my father,
Yes.
He loved saying this: Zionism has never been a first name. It has always been a surname, a family name. And from all the spectrum, Jeremy, that we are facing today and that we've always faced, the one thing that sticks with me is humanism. And the one thing I will never give up is humanism towards ourselves and towards our neighbors. And any Zionist branch that has kept up its humanism is my kind of Zionism.
Thank you. Thank you so much for both of you for being with us today. We, in the spirit of discussion, do have a discussion portion to follow this. It is not with the speakers, it is with J Street staff, and it really does focus on what does Zionism mean for our work as pro-peace, pro-Israel advocates. So Lindsay put the link in the chat. We have capped those discussion groups so that they remain small. So if you want to come and you haven't registered, there are a couple slots open. But otherwise, I would invite the people who registered to continue discussions about this to click on that next meeting link to join the discussions. And we will close this out and say thank you again to our panelists. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Christine. Thank you, Fania.
All the best.